Fishermen swear they've heard crying in the fog. Hunters have seen faces staring up from the water, faces that vanish when touched by light. And the old folks, they just shake their heads and say, "The swamp keeps what it wants." Tonight, we're going deep into that darkness, past the rotting trees, past the fog that never lifts, past the line where the world feels wrong. So settle in, turn down the lights, and listen closely. Because once you step into these waters, there's no way to tell what might reach back. Have you ever felt like the wilderness was listening to you? What would you do if it started speaking back, revealing secrets you never told anyone? Sometimes the most terrifying discoveries aren't about what's out there in the darkness. They're about realizing something out there knows everything about you. I've been a wildlife photographer for 12 years, and I thought I'd seen everything the Louisiana swamps had to offer. The Atchafalaya Basin was my sanctuary, my escape from the noise of civilization. I'd spent countless nights alone on wooden platforms, surrounded by black water and ancient cypress trees, capturing images of herons at dawn and alligators gliding through moonlit channels. The solitude never bothered me. In fact, I craved it. But that was before the logs started whispering. It was late October when I set up camp on a platform I'd used dozens of times before. The air was thick with fog, and Spanish moss hung like gray curtains from every branch, creating walls of shadow that shifted with the slightest breeze. I'd come to photograph the seasonal bird migration, planning to stay for 5 nights. The first evening passed normally. I cooked a simple meal on my camp stove, organized my camera equipment, and settled into my sleeping bag as darkness consumed the swamp. The usual symphony of frogs and insects lulled me toward sleep. That's when I heard it. A whisper, so faint I thought it was wind moving through the moss. But there was no wind that night. The air hung still and heavy, pressing down on everything. I sat up, listening. Nothing. I convinced myself I'd imagined it and lay back down. Then I heard it again, clearer this time. It sounded like 2 people having a conversation, their voices low and urgent. But I couldn't make out the words. The sound was coming from the water, somewhere to my left. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam across the swamp. About 20 feet from my platform, a massive cypress log lay half submerged in the water. It had been there on my previous visits, covered in moss and fungi, slowly rotting back into the ecosystem. The log was ancient, probably 8 feet long and 3 feet in diameter. My light passed over it, revealing nothing unusual. The whispering stopped. I told myself it was probably just water moving through hollow spaces in the decaying wood, creating weird acoustics. Swamps do that. They play tricks on your mind. The second night, the whispers came back, louder and earlier. This time they started just after sunset, before I'd even finished eating dinner. I tried to ignore them, focusing on reviewing the photos I'd taken that day. But the voices grew more distinct. I could almost make out words now. The cadence was definitely conversational. One voice would speak, then another would respond. The rhythm was too perfect to be random water sounds or wind. Against my better judgment, I climbed down from the platform and waded into the shallow water toward the log. The bottom was soft mud that tried to suck off my boots with each step. The water was bathwater warm and smelled of decomposition and life happening simultaneously. As I got closer, the whispering stopped abruptly, like someone had flipped a switch. I stood there in the darkness, my flashlight beam fixed on the log, feeling incredibly foolish. Up close, I could see the wood was more deteriorated than I'd realized. Large sections had rotted away, creating hollow chambers inside. Air pockets, probably. That had to be the explanation. I returned to my platform, but sleep didn't come easily. Every sound seemed amplified. Every splash of a fish or grunt of an alligator made my heart race. I kept my flashlight on all night, pointed at the log. It remained silent and still, just a dead piece of wood slowly dissolving into the swamp. The third night changed everything. The whispers started at dusk again, but this time I could understand them. Not every word, but enough. And what I heard made my blood turn cold. One of the voices said my name, not my full name, my nickname, the one only my sister calls me, a name I'd never spoken aloud during any of my swamp visits. I froze, dinner fork halfway to my mouth. The voice continued, and I heard it say something about my divorce. My divorce that had been finalized just 3 months ago. A divorce I hadn't discussed with anyone except my lawyer and my sister. Then the second voice joined in, and they started talking about my daughter, using her name, discussing the argument we'd had before I left for this trip. An argument that had happened in my kitchen, 200 miles away, just 48 hours earlier. My hands started shaking. I set down my fork and forced myself to breathe. This wasn't possible. I was hallucinating. Maybe I'd gotten some bad water, or the stress of the past few months was finally breaking me. But the voices continued, calm and conversational, discussing intimate details of my life like they were reading from my diary. They talked about my father's death, about the loan I'd taken out to buy new camera equipment, about the medication I take for anxiety. Things no one could possibly know unless they'd been living inside my head. I should have left right then. I should have packed my gear, climbed into my kayak, and paddled back to civilization. But I didn't. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the photographer in me, the part that always needs to document and understand. Or maybe it was something else, a pull, a compulsion I didn't recognize. Instead of leaving, I grabbed my audio recorder and pointed it at the log. The fourth night, the voices predicted my future. They started by recounting what I'd done that day. Every photograph I'd taken, every meal I'd eaten, even the times I'd relieved myself off the edge of the platform. They described my movements with perfect accuracy. Then they shifted to tomorrow. They told me I would wake at 6:17 in the morning, that I would make coffee and spill, some on my left boot, that I would see a white egret land on the log at 7:42, that I would take 16 photographs of it, that I would decide to leave but change my mind at the last moment. I barely slept. When morning came, I was determined to prove them wrong. I forced myself to stay in my sleeping bag past 6:17, but at 6:18, my alarm went off. An alarm I didn't remember setting. I made coffee, my hands shaking so badly I did spill some. It landed on my left boot. At 7:42 exactly, a white egret landed on the log. I didn't want to photograph it. I actively tried not to. But my hands moved on their own, raising the camera, adjusting the settings, firing off shot after shot. When I checked the camera, there were exactly 16 images. I packed my gear. I was leaving. This was beyond explanation, beyond rationality. I loaded everything into my kayak, tied it all down, and was about to push off when I heard the voices again. This time they were laughing. Not cruel laughter, not mocking. Just amused. And one of them said, "He'll be back tomorrow. He always comes back." I paddled away as fast as I could, my arms burning with effort. The channels seemed longer than I remembered. The fog was thicker. Twice I got turned around and had to backtrack. When I finally reached my truck, the sun was setting. I'd been paddling for 8 hours on what should have been a 2-hour trip. I loaded my gear and drove toward home, glancing in the rearview mirror every few seconds. But I didn't go home. 50 miles down the highway, I pulled over. I sat in a gas station parking lot for 3 hours, engine running, hands gripping the steering wheel. The voice's words echoed in my head. He always comes back. Always. Not he will come back. Always. Like this had happened before. Like this was a loop I'd been caught in without knowing it. I checked my phone and scrolled through my photos from the trip. Hundreds of images of birds, water, trees. And there, in the background of at least 30 photos, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. In each image, if you looked carefully at the log, there were shapes in the shadows of its hollow chambers. Shapes that looked like faces. Dozens of faces, all different, all staring directly at the camera. All staring at me. My hands found the steering wheel again. I turned the truck around. I drove back to the basin. I'm sitting on the platform now, writing this on my phone as the sun sets on my 5th night. The voices will start soon. They always do. And tonight, they've promised to tell me the truth about what the log really is, and why it knows everything about me. The terrible thing is, I want to know. Despite the fear, despite every instinct screaming at me to run, I need to understand. The log is whispering now, and this time, the voices sound familiar. One of them sounds like my father. The other sounds like me. I'm going to wade out to the log tonight. I'm going to look inside those hollow chambers. The voices say there's room for one more, and they've been saving a space specifically for me. They say I'll finally understand everything once I'm inside. They say it doesn't hurt. I believe them. God help me. I believe them. How long could you hold your breath while something unseen drags you deeper into darkness? What happens when your only escape route closes behind you? Sometimes the most dangerous discoveries aren't the ones we make. They're the ones that have been waiting to make us. I've been a commercial fisherman working Florida's waters for 23 years. The Atchafalaya Swamp has always been my territory, my livelihood. I know every channel, every submerged stump, every gator nest. Or at least I thought I did. What I found 3 weeks ago changed everything I understood about these waters. And now I'm writing this because I need someone to know what's down there before I go back. Because I am going back. I don't have a choice anymore. It started with the fish. My usual spots had gone dead. No bass, no catfish, nothing. After 4 days of empty nets, I was getting desperate. Fuel costs money, and my boat payment was coming due. I started exploring areas I normally avoided, deeper sections where the water turns black and the cypress roots create underwater labyrinths that can trap your nets. That's when my depth finder started acting strange. I was motoring slowly through a section of water about 15 feet deep when the reading suddenly jumped to 40 feet, then back to 15, then to 60. The screen flickered like something was interfering with the signal. I killed the engine and dropped anchor, then suited up for a dive. The water in the Atchafalaya is tannic acid dark. You can barely see your hand 6 inches from your face. But I had a good waterproof light and years of experience diving blind. I went down slowly, following my anchor line. The temperature dropped fast, which was wrong. Swamp water stays warm, even at depth. At 20 feet, my light caught something that made me stop. Trees. Massive cypress trees, standing upright on the bottom like a drowned forest. But these weren't rotted stumps or fallen logs. These were intact trees with bark still on them, branches spreading out in perfect form. They looked fresh, like they'd been submerged yesterday instead of centuries ago. I swam closer. fascinated despite the cold that was seeping through my wetsuit. The trees were arranged in a rough circle, maybe 30 feet in diameter. In the center was a clearing, and the bottom there dropped away into deeper darkness. My depth gauge read 45 feet. I'd never known this section went that deep. As I circled the grove, my light caught something else. An opening in one of the larger trees. Not a crack or a rot hole, but a smooth entrance about 3 feet wide, leading into the hollow interior. Professional curiosity got the better of me. I'd heard about sinker logs, ancient cypress trees that fall into water and become perfectly preserved, so dense they sink instead of float. They're valuable, worth thousands of dollars to the right buyer. If this whole grove was made of sinker cypress, I'd just found a fortune. I swam to the opening and shined my light inside. The tree was completely hollow, and the interior was full of air. Not water, air. I could see the surface of an air pocket reflecting my light about 4 feet up inside the trunk. That was impossible. At this depth, any air pocket should have been compressed or forced out long ago. But there it was, shimmering like mercury. Without thinking, I pulled my regulator out and stuck my head up into the pocket. The air was breathable, stale and cold, but breathable. I filled my lungs, tasting minerals and age. The inside of the tree was smooth, worn like polished wood, and carved into the walls were marks, scratches, words, initials. I recognized some as English, but others were older, symbols I didn't understand. Some looked like they'd been made with knives. Others looked like they'd been clawed. My light caught something floating in the air pocket. A laminated driver's license, the kind that should have sunk or been destroyed by water. I grabbed it. The face staring back at me belonged to a man named David Ketchum, reported missing in 2019 while fishing in the Okefenokee. I'd heard about his disappearance. They'd searched for weeks and found nothing. That's when I felt it. A pull on my ankle. Not a grab, but a steady pressure, like a current dragging me down and back, out of the tree. I dropped down and swept my light around. Nothing there. The water was empty, except for the grove. But the pull came again, stronger, and I felt myself being drawn toward another tree, one with a larger opening near its base. I kicked hard, fighting the current that shouldn't exist in still swamp water. The pull stopped as suddenly as it started. My heart was hammering, and I was breathing too fast, burning through my air. I checked my pressure gauge, half tank, plenty to surface. But as I started up, I noticed something that made my chest tighten with panic. The trees had moved. The grove had rotated somehow, and now the clearing in the center was directly beneath me. The opening that led to deeper water was no longer where it had been. I spun in the water, disoriented. My anchor line should have been to my left, but it wasn't there. I couldn't see it anywhere. The trees surrounded me now, their branches reaching out like arms. I picked a direction and swam, my light cutting through the murk. I should have cleared the grove in seconds, but instead I found myself back in the center. The trees had closed ranks. Where there had been gaps wide enough to swim through, now there were only solid walls of trunk and branch. Panic makes you stupid underwater. I know that. I've seen divers die because they panicked. But knowing it doesn't help when you're living it. I swam harder, faster, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My air gauge dropped to a quarter tank. The pull came back, and this time it was strong enough to yank me downward. My light swung wildly, and I saw them. In the water below me, in the deeper darkness, there were things moving. Pale shapes, human-sized, swimming with jerky, unnatural movements. They came up fast, I caught glimpses, faces that were wrong, bodies that bent in impossible ways, hands with too many fingers reaching up toward me. One of them grabbed my fin, and I kicked frantically, feeling the rubber tear. My regulator was torn from my mouth. I grabbed for it, found it, cleared it, and sucked in water-tainted air. My gauge hit red. Maybe 3 minutes left. The things were pulling me down, hand over hand, toward the opening in the center of the grove. I could see it now. It wasn't just deeper water. It was a shaft, perfectly round, dropping straight down into the earth. And lining the walls of that shaft were more trees, more air pockets, more openings. It went down impossibly far, hundreds of feet, maybe more. And in each hollow tree, I could see lights. Small, flickering lights, like flashlights or phones, still glowing in their preserved air pockets. I pulled my dive knife and slashed at the hands holding me. The blade connected with something that felt like wood, not flesh, splinters, not blood. The grip loosened for a second, and I kicked with everything I had. My lungs were screaming. Black spots danced in my vision. I couldn't see the surface, couldn't see anything but trees and darkness, and those pale shapes circling. Then my hand hit something, my anchor line. I grabbed it like salvation and pulled myself up, climbing hand over hand. The shapes followed but stopped at 20 feet, hovering just below me like they couldn't or wouldn't go higher. I broke the surface and hauled myself into my boat, retching swamp water and gasping. I should have left, should have pulled anchor and never come back. But when I got home and developed the underwater camera I'd had mounted on my helmet, I saw things I hadn't noticed during the dive. In every tree opening, in every air pocket, there were people. Not the things that had grabbed me. Actual people, alive, living in those hollow trees. I could see them clearly in the stills. Men, women, some in modern clothes, others in outfits from decades past. They were looking at the camera, looking at me, and they were smiling. I went back the next day. I couldn't help it. The grove was still there, but different. More trees had appeared, and they were arranged in a tighter circle. I dove again, and this time, I made it into one of the trees before the pull started. The air pocket was larger, and someone had carved a message into the wall. Day 847. The surface is a memory. The depth is forever. I've been back 6 times now. Each time the grove is bigger. Each time I find more evidence. Wallets, phones, jewelry, all perfectly preserved in the air pockets. And each time, I stay down a little longer. The things in the deep don't seem as frightening anymore. Yesterday I stayed down until my air ran completely out, and I breathed from one of the tree pockets for 20 minutes. The air tasted sweet. The carved messages on the walls made sense. They were instructions, warnings, welcomes. There's a tree waiting for me now. I can feel it when I sleep. It has my name carved in it, though I never carved it myself. The air pocket inside is larger than the others, more comfortable. The things in the deep aren't monsters. They're guides, helpers. They've been preparing my space, making it ready. All I have to do is swim down, find my tree, and breathe the air inside. After that, I won't need to surface anymore. I can stay in the grove, in the deep, where the water pressure crushes all your doubts and the darkness becomes clarity. I'm loading my boat now. One last dive. But this time I'm not bringing enough air to come back up. I'm bringing tools instead, carving tools, so I can add my own messages to the walls. So I can welcome the next person who finds the grove. Because it's growing, spreading, adding more trees every day. Eventually, it will cover the entire swamp bottom. Eventually, Everyone will find their tree, their pocket of sweet air, their place in the deep. The depth finder is showing 90 feet now in water that should be 15 feet deep. The grove is calling. My tree is waiting. And honestly, I'm tired of fighting the pull. What would you do if you were miles from help and realized you weren't alone anymore? How would you sleep knowing someone, or something, has been in your bed? The worst violations aren't the ones that happen in front of you. They're the ones that happen when you're not looking. I'm a nature researcher specializing in coastal bird populations, and I'd been assigned to a 3-month solo study in Georgia's marshlands. The cabin they provided was perfect for my needs. Basic but functional, with a small lab area, a bedroom, and a kitchen. It sat on a raised foundation surrounded by endless sawgrass and tidal pools, accessible only by a narrow boat channel. The isolation was exactly what I wanted. No distractions, no interruptions, just me and my work. That's what I thought anyway. The first week passed without incident. My days fell into a comfortable rhythm. Wake at dawn, boat out to observation points, collect data, return to the cabin by evening, analyze samples, sleep, repeat. The marsh was alive with sound, but empty of people. The nearest occupied building was a ranger station 12 miles away. I'd check in with them by radio every few days, but otherwise, I was completely alone. It was paradise. The changes started small. On my 8th day, I came back to find the kitchen chairs rearranged. Not dramatically, just pulled out from the table at slightly different angles than I'd left them. I noticed because I'm particular about my space. I always push the chairs in completely, flush with the table. These were out maybe 6 inches, like someone had been sitting in them. I told myself I was mistaken, that I'd forgotten to push them in that morning. The next day, my soap was in the wrong place. I keep it on the left side of the sink, but it was on the right. Small thing, meaningless, really. Except I hadn't moved it. That night, I checked all the doors and windows before bed. Everything was locked tight. The cabin sat on pilings 8 feet off the marsh floor, and there was no way up except the front steps. I was being paranoid. The isolation was playing tricks on my mind. On day 10, I found a coffee mug in the sink, a mug I hadn't used. I only have 2 mugs in the cabin, one with a blue rim that I use every morning, and one with a red rim that I'd left in the cupboard. The red-rimmed mug was in the sink, still slightly warm, with coffee residue in the bottom. I don't drink coffee in the afternoon. I'd been gone all day. Someone had been in my cabin, made themselves coffee, and left the mug for me to find. I tore the cabin apart looking for signs of entry. Nothing. No broken locks, no jimmied windows, no footprints in the dust on the porch. I radioed the ranger station and told them what happened. They said they'd send someone in 2 days when the tides were right for the channel. 2 days. I locked myself in the bedroom that night, a chair wedged under the doorknob, my specimen knife clutched in my hand. Nothing happened that night. But the next morning, the chair in front of my door had been moved. Not removed, moved. It was now angled differently, like someone had carefully picked it up, examined it, and set it back down wrong. And on my pillow, right where my head had been, there was a single long black hair. My hair is blonde. I didn't go out on the marsh that day. I stayed in the cabin, watching the windows, listening to every sound. The ranger was coming tomorrow. I could survive 1 more day. I sat at the kitchen table and tried to work on my data, but my hands were shaking too badly to write. That's when I noticed the smell. Faint, but distinct. Someone else's sweat, someone else's skin. the smell of another person in my space. I grabbed my radio and called the ranger station. No answer. I tried for an hour, calling every 15 minutes. Nothing but static. The radio had worked fine yesterday. I checked the batteries, the antenna, everything. It should have been working. But all I got was dead air and occasionally, underneath the static, what sounded like breathing. As the sun set, I made a decision. I would leave. Forget the ranger. Forget protocol. I'd take my boat and navigate the channels in the dark. It would be dangerous, but staying felt more dangerous. I packed a bag with essentials and headed for the door. That's when I saw the mud. There were footprints on the porch, fresh mud, still wet, trailing from the steps to my door. But these prints were wrong. They faced the wrong direction. They led away from my door, not toward it, like someone had been inside and walked out backward. The prints went down the steps and then just stopped at the bottom, in the middle of the marsh grass. No trail leading away. Just stopped. I ran back inside and locked the door. The footprints were impossible. I'd been watching the door all day. Nobody had come in or out. But the mud was real, and it was fresh. I grabbed the largest knife from the kitchen and went through every room, every closet, every possible hiding spot. The cabin wasn't large. There was nowhere for a person to hide. I was alone, except I wasn't. That night, I heard them. Footsteps, careful and deliberate, moving through the cabin while I lay frozen in my bed. The steps went from the kitchen to the lab area, paused, then came down the hallway toward my room. They stopped outside my door. I waited for the handle to turn, for the door to open, but nothing happened. The presence just stood there. I could hear breathing through the thin door. After 20 minutes, the footsteps retreated. I didn't sleep. When dawn came, I opened my door and stepped into a nightmare. Everything in the cabin had been moved. Not destroyed, not ransacked. Reorganized. The furniture was rearranged into different configurations. My research papers were restacked in neat piles, but in a different order. My clothes had been refolded and put back in drawers. The books on my shelf were alphabetized when they hadn't been before. Someone had hours going through everything I owned, touching it all, changing it all. And in the bathroom, written in the condensation on the mirror, were 2 words. Thank you. I ran outside to my boat. The ranger would be here soon. I just needed to hold on a little longer. But my boat was different too. The coiled rope was coiled the opposite direction. The oars were on the wrong side. And the life jacket I always kept under the seat was now folded neatly on the seat, with a note pinned to it. The handwriting was neat, precise. You left this behind last time. You should be more careful. Last time. What did that mean? I'd never left my life jacket behind. I'd never been careless with my safety equipment. But the note suggested this had happened before, that I'd been here before, that this was a pattern. I checked my research journal, flipping back through weeks of entries. My handwriting looked wrong in places. Some pages seemed to be in my writing, but talked about observations I didn't remember making. References to sounds in the night, to feeling watched, to finding things moved. I had no memory of writing any of it. The dates were all correct. The data was all mine, but scattered throughout were sentences that I didn't recognize. It was in the cabin again today. I heard it moving my things. I can't remember if I locked the door or if it locked the door. The ranger boat arrived at noon. I was waiting on the porch, my bag packed, ready to leave and never come back. But when the ranger climbed the steps, her face was confused. She asked me why I'd called for emergency pickup. I told her everything, the moved objects, the footprints, the person in my cabin. She listened with growing concern, then asked if she could come inside. We walked through the cabin together. Everything looked normal. The chairs were pushed in at the table. The soap was where it should be. My research papers were in the order I'd left them. The red-rimmed mug wasn't in the sink. There were no footprints on the porch. The condensation message was gone. She checked every room, every corner. No signs of intrusion. No evidence of anything wrong. She asked me gently if I'd been sleeping well, if the isolation was getting to me. She suggested I take a few days at the ranger station, get some rest, some company. I agreed because what else could I do? The evidence was gone. I looked crazy. Maybe I was crazy. But as we loaded my bag into the ranger's boat, I glanced back at the cabin. In the bedroom window, the curtain moved. Just slightly, like someone had been watching us and let it fall back into place. The ranger didn't notice. She was already in the boat, starting the engine. I didn't tell her. We drove back to the ranger station, and I spent 3 days there eating regular meals, sleeping in a room with other people nearby, convincing myself I'd imagined everything. The rangers were kind. They talked about stress and isolation effects. They showed me studies about people who spend too long alone developing false memories and paranoid delusions. It made sense. I wanted it to make sense. On the 4th day, I went back. My research wasn't finished, and I couldn't afford to abandon the project. The rangers were reluctant, but agreed to check on me daily by radio. I promised to report anything unusual immediately. They helped me unload my supplies and waited while I settled back in. Everything was exactly as I'd left it 4 days ago. Normal, untouched. I waved goodbye to the rangers and watched their boat disappear into the marsh channels. Then I walked back inside and closed the door. That's when I smelled it. Coffee, fresh coffee. The red-rimmed mug was on the counter, still warm, still full. And next to it was a note in that same precise handwriting. Welcome home. I kept everything ready for you. I knew you'd come back. They always come back. I'm looking at that note now. I should radio for help. I should leave again. But something is stopping me. The cabin feels different this time. Not threatening. Familiar. Like I've been here longer than 3 weeks. Like I've been here for years. There are photographs on the wall I don't remember hanging. Pictures of the marsh, pictures of birds, pictures of the cabin from different angles. In one photo, I can see myself through the window, working at my desk. I didn't take that photo. I don't know who did. The sun is setting now. Soon I'll hear the footsteps again. But this time, I think I'm going to open the door. I think I'm going to finally see who's been sharing this cabin with me. Or maybe I already know. Maybe I've always known. Maybe I'm not the researcher. Maybe I'm what's being studied. The footsteps are starting. They're in the kitchen. They're coming down the hall. The door handle is turning. I'm not afraid anymore. I'm curious. If your own voice turned against you, speaking words you never said, would you trust anything you hear, including your own thoughts? In the deep places of the world, sound doesn't always obey the rules we expect it to follow. My name is Reed, and I've been kayaking the blackwater swamps of South Carolina for 8 years. I know the Congaree, the Edisto, every major waterway in the Low Country. I'm not some weekend warrior. I'm a guide, a professional. People pay me good money to show them parts of the swamp they'd never find on their own. I'm writing this at a motel 200 miles from those waters, and I'm never going back. What I found in that unmarked channel took my voice, my words, my sounds, and gave them back corrupted. And the worst part is, I can still hear the echoes, even here. It happened during a solo scouting trip. I was looking for new routes to take clients, places off the main channels where the tourism hadn't ruined the wildness. I had a GPS, detailed maps, and enough experience to navigate by instinct. The water was that distinctive black water color. Tannins from decaying vegetation, turning it the color of strong tea, perfectly clear but dark as oil. Cypress knees jutted up everywhere, like Gothic sculptures, and the canopy overhead was so thick it created permanent twilight, even at noon. I'd been paddling for about 3 hours when I noticed a narrow channel branching off to my left. It wasn't on my map or my GPS. That wasn't unusual. These waterways shift with floods and droughts, creating temporary passages that don't exist long enough to be officially recorded. The channel was maybe 15 feet wide, lined with massive bald cypress trees whose roots created a natural corridor. Something about it appealed to me. It looked pristine, untouched. I pointed my kayak into the opening and started paddling. The first thing I noticed was the silence. The swamp is never truly quiet. There's always something chirping, splashing, rustling. But this channel was dead silent. No birds, no insects, no frogs. Just the sound of my paddle dipping into the water. Even that seemed muted, absorbed by the trees somehow. I should have turned back right then, but curiosity pushed me forward. The channel curved gently to the right, and the cypress trees grew closer together, their trunks creating what looked like acoustic chambers. I cleared my throat, and the sound echoed back to me. Normal enough, except the echo came back about 3 seconds delayed, which was wrong for the distance. Sound travels fast. That echo should have returned almost instantly. I said hello just to test it, and the echo came back even more delayed, 5 seconds this time. And it didn't sound quite right. The pitch was slightly off, like someone had adjusted the playback speed. I laughed nervously, and the echo laughed back. But my laugh had been short and clipped. The echo laugh was longer, fuller, more genuine, like someone else was laughing at a joke I didn't understand. That's when I decided to turn around. But when I tried to paddle backward, I realized the channel had narrowed behind me. The trees had somehow closed ranks, their trunks now less than 6 feet apart. There was no way my kayak would fit through that gap. The only direction was forward. I kept paddling, and I kept quiet. No more testing the echoes. But the silence felt oppressive now, pressing against my eardrums. After another 10 minutes, I couldn't stand it anymore. I needed to hear something, anything. I whispered, "This is wrong," barely audible even to myself. The echo came back as a shout, "This is wrong!" My whisper returned as a scream, my own voice, but amplified into terror I hadn't felt yet. My hands started shaking on the paddle. I tried to stay calm, breathing deeply, but each breath I took echoed back as panicked hyperventilation. The sounds I was making were being transformed into their worst versions. Calm became panic. Quiet became loud. Confidence became fear. The channel was taking my sounds and showing me what they could become. I made the mistake of speaking again. I said, "I need to get out of here." The words came back twisted. "I need to stay here forever." My voice, my inflection, but words I hadn't spoken. I stopped paddling and sat perfectly still. If I didn't make any sound, the channel couldn't twist it. I would just drift silently until I found a way out. But then I heard my voice coming from ahead of me, around the next bend. It was having a conversation with someone. I heard myself say, "Lily thinks I'm working today." That was true. My girlfriend Lily did think I was working. I told her I'd be back by evening, but I hadn't spoken those words. The echo version of me continued. She won't know anything's wrong until tomorrow. By then, it'll be too late. Another voice responded, and I recognized it as my business partner Atticus. Except Atticus wasn't here. He was back in Charleston. The echo Atticus said, "You should have stayed on the main channel, Reed. Everyone who comes into this channel stays." And then my voice responded with something that froze my blood. "I know. That's why I came here. I've been hearing it call me for months." That wasn't true. I hadn't been hearing anything. I'd found this channel by accident. But the certainty in my echo voice made me doubt myself. Had I been having dreams about a narrow channel? Had something been pulling me here without my conscious knowledge? I couldn't remember anymore. The conversation ahead continued. I heard myself telling Atticus things I'd never told anyone. Fears, secrets, dark thoughts I barely admitted to myself. And Atticus was responding with advice, with comfort, with understanding. They were having the kind of deep conversation I'd always wanted to have with him, but never had the courage for. Except it wasn't real. Neither of them were really here. It was just the channel, taking fragments of my voice and weaving them into dialogue. Started paddling faster, desperate to get away from the sound of my own confessions. But the faster I paddled, the more sounds I made, the splash of water, the creak of the kayak, my own labored breathing. And each sound echoed back wrong. The splashes became footsteps. The creaks became doors slamming. My breathing became someone else's breathing, right behind me. I spun around, nearly capsizing the kayak. Nothing there, just the narrow channel and the oppressive trees. But I could still hear breathing behind me, getting closer. When I turned back forward, I saw someone standing on a cypress knee about 20 feet ahead. It was me. Same clothes, same face, same kayak paddle held in hand. The other me smiled and spoke, but the words came from behind me, like the echo was traveling backward. "You can't leave until you hear everything you've never said." The other me stepped off the cypress knee and walked across the water toward me. Not floating, not swimming. Walking like the surface was solid ground. With each step, I heard more echoes. I heard myself telling my father I hated him before he died. I heard myself confessing to mistakes I'd covered up. I heard myself saying Lily's name with contempt I didn't feel. I heard myself laugh at Atticus behind his back. Every cruel thought, every hidden resentment, every lie I'd ever told, all of it spoken in my voice, echoing through the channel. The walking version of me reached my kayak and leaned down, bringing his face close to mine. When he spoke, the words came out of my mouth instead of his. "This is who you really are when no one's listening." I tried to scream, but the sound that came out was laughter. I tried to paddle away, but my arms wouldn't move. The other me straightened up and pointed deeper into the channel. "Keep going. There are more of us waiting. Every version of you that you've tried to suppress. We all live here now." I don't know how long I drifted after that. Time felt wrong in the channel, stretched and compressed randomly. The trees created chambers that reflected sound in impossible ways. I heard conversations between versions of myself from different ages, child me talking to teenage me, elderly me warning current me about decisions I hadn't made yet. I heard myself speaking languages I didn't know, singing songs I'd never learned, screaming in voices that weren't quite human. Eventually, the channel widened. The trees pulled back. The canopy opened up, and I saw actual sunlight. I paddled frantically toward it, not believing it was real until my kayak broke out into a wide section of familiar water. I recognized this area. It was part of the main channel, only about a mile from where I'd parked my truck. I'd somehow looped back. I paddled harder than I've ever paddled in my life. But the echoes followed me. Even in the open water, I could hear my voice coming from the trees, from beneath the water, from inside my own head. Every word I spoke came back twisted. When I reached my truck and loaded the kayak, I tried to call Lily. I said, "I'm okay, I'm coming home." But what she heard, based on her panicked response, was something different. She said I'd told her I was never coming home, that I'd found where I belonged. I drove straight here, to this motel. I've been here for 4 days. I can't go home because every time I try to speak, the wrong words come out. I called Atticus to tell him about the channel, but he said I spent 20 minutes describing how much I resented our partnership, how I'd been planning to destroy the business. I never said any of that. At least, I don't think I did. The channel is still in my head, still twisting my sounds. Yesterday, I heard myself talking in the motel bathroom when I was in bed. I heard my voice having a conversation with someone named Tobias about giving up and going back to the channel. I don't know anyone named Tobias. This morning, I found wet footprints leading from the bathroom to my bed, even though I hadn't showered. The prints looked like kayak paddle marks. I'm afraid to speak now. I'm afraid that everything I say will come out corrupted, that the channel has permanently altered how my voice works. I'm writing this instead. But even as I write, I can hear myself reading the words aloud in my head. And they don't sound like what I'm writing. They sound like an invitation. They sound like coordinates. They sound like a map back to that unmarked channel. Lily stopped answering my calls. Atticus sent me a message saying he's filing dissolution papers for our business. My voice has cost me everything, and I don't even know what I'm actually saying anymore. The worst part is, I'm starting to miss the channel. In there, at least the echoes were honest. They showed me every version of myself I'd been hiding. Out here, I'm just a man whose words can't be trusted. Tonight, I think I'm going to drive back. Not to the swamp. I know better than that. But I can't stay in the normal world when my voice doesn't work right anymore. Maybe there's another channel somewhere. Maybe this happens to other people. Maybe there's a place where all the corrupted voices go, where everyone's echoes have turned against them. Or maybe I'll just stop talking entirely. Let the echoes have the last word. They usually do anyway. What happens when the forest stops being background scenery and becomes an audience? How do you escape when the trees themselves won't let you leave? Nature has eyes everywhere. You just don't notice them until they start noticing you back. I never believed in anything supernatural. As a botanist specializing in rare orchids, I dealt in facts, data, and observable phenomena. The supernatural was for people who didn't understand science. That confidence lasted right up until I spent 6 days in the East Texas bayou, studying a colony of ghost orchids that shouldn't have existed that far west. What I discovered there had nothing to do with orchids and everything to do with what watches us when we think we're alone in the wilderness. My name is Amelia, and I've spent the last decade traveling to remote locations documenting endangered plant species. I've worked in jungles, deserts, mountains, places where most people would feel vulnerable. I never did. Plants were predictable. They didn't judge, didn't threaten, didn't care about my presence. The bayou was supposed to be just another assignment. 3 weeks of surveys, photographs, and sample collection. I didn't make it past the first week. The bayou was dense with bald cypress and tupelo trees, their trunks massive and ancient, rising out of tea-colored water like pillars in a flooded cathedral. Spanish moss hung so thick it created curtains between the trees, and the humidity was oppressive even in early morning. I'd set up a base camp on a dry ridge about a quarter-mile from the orchid colony. The area was remote enough that I hadn't seen another human since the boat dropped me off. On the first day, I was too focused on my work to notice anything strange. The orchids were thriving in conditions that shouldn't have supported them, and I spent hours documenting their root structures and surrounding environment. It wasn't until I was hiking back to camp that I felt it. The sensation of being watched. Not the ambient awareness of wildlife, but specific, focused attention. I stopped and looked around. The trees surrounded me in every direction, their thick trunks creating natural barriers. The shadows between them were deep and impenetrable. I shook it off as nerves. I was alone in an unfamiliar environment. Of course I felt watched. That's what isolation does to the human brain. But that night at camp, the feeling intensified. As I sat by my small campfire eating dinner, I couldn't shake the impression that something was observing me from the darkness beyond the firelight. Every time I looked up, I felt like I'd just missed seeing something move. Like eyes had been on me and had looked away the instant before I could catch them. The second day, I noticed the faces. I was photographing a particularly beautiful specimen when I happened to glance at the cypress tree behind it. The bark had natural patterns. All bark does. But this pattern looked disturbingly like a human face. Two knots formed. Eyes, a vertical split in the bark created a mouth, and the overall arrangement of texture and shadow formed distinct features. Not vague pareidolia that your brain forces into patterns, but clear, unmistakable features. I stepped closer and examined it. Just bark. Just random natural formation. I took a photo for my records and moved on. But then I saw another face, and another. The more I looked, the more I found. Every tree seemed to have at least one face-like formation in its bark. Some were small, others were large enough to span 3 feet of trunk. Some appeared peaceful, others looked anguished. I told myself this was normal, that humans are programmed to see faces in random patterns. It's a survival mechanism, pattern recognition gone into overdrive. There was nothing supernatural about bark that happened to look like faces. Except they were watching me. On the third day, I set up a time-lapse camera to photograph orchid blooming patterns. When I reviewed the footage that evening, I saw something that made my hands go numb. In the background of every frame, there was a tree with a prominent face formation. And throughout the sequence, the face's expression changed. The eyes, just knots in the bark, seemed to track the movement of the flowers. The mouth, just a crack, appeared to shift from neutral to something that looked like a smile. I watched the footage 6 times. It had to be changing light conditions, creating the illusion of movement. Shadows shifting as the sun moved. Except the time lapse was only 4 hours long, and the sun had barely moved in that time. The changes in the face were too dramatic to be explained by subtle light shifts. I deleted the footage. I don't know why. Maybe I was afraid of what it implied. Maybe I knew that if I showed it to anyone, they'd think I'd manipulated it. Or maybe I just didn't want proof of what I was beginning to suspect. That night, I heard them moving. Not the trees themselves. Trees don't move. But something in the trees. Something that made the bark creak and groan like wooden joints flexing. I lay in my tent with my flashlight off, listening to the sounds of the bayou transforming into something alien. The normal night sounds, frogs, insects, distant animals, had stopped completely. The only sounds were the trees, creaking and settling like a crowd of people shifting their weight while standing still for too long. I turned on my flashlight and pointed it at the nearest tree, about 15 feet from my tent. There was a face in the bark, positioned at exactly my eye level. I'd walked past that tree dozens of times and never noticed the face before. The knot eyes were looking directly at my tent, directly at me. I moved the flashlight beam to another tree, another face, also looking at my tent. I spun in a circle, illuminating tree after tree. Every single one had a face turned toward me. Dozens of faces, all at different heights, all different expressions, but all watching me with unmistakable focus. I didn't sleep that night. When dawn came, I packed my essential gear and prepared to hike out to the extraction point. I had a satellite phone for emergencies, and this qualified. I'd call for early pickup, abandon the orchid survey, and leave this place to its secrets. But when I tried to follow my GPS back to the boat landing, I couldn't find the trail. I'd marked the route carefully, flagging trees every 100 yards. The flags were gone, not fallen or removed. Gone, like they'd never existed. I picked a direction and walked, trusting my compass. But the bayou seemed to shift around me. I'd walk for 30 minutes and find myself back at a landmark I'd passed earlier. The trees were moving, I was sure of it now. Not in any way I could observe directly, but between glances, when my attention shifted. They were rearranging themselves, creating a maze, keeping me contained. On the 4th day, I stopped trying to leave. Something had broken in me, some rational part that insisted on logical explanations. I set up camp in a new location and just observed. The faces in the trees were more obvious now, or maybe I'd just gotten better at seeing them. They were everywhere, hundreds of them, covering every trunk in overlapping features. And they were definitely watching me. When I moved, the eyes tracked me. When I spoke aloud to myself, the mouth seemed to react, some opening slightly, others pressing into tight lines. I started talking to them. Not because I thought they'd respond, but because the silence was driving me insane. I told them about my research, about my life, about why I'd become a botanist. And the trees listened. I could feel their attention, patient and ancient and utterly inhuman. They'd been here for hundreds of years, maybe thousands. How many other people had they watched? How many had noticed the faces and convinced themselves it was nothing? How many had tried to leave and succeeded? The answer came on the 5th day, when I found the backpack. It was half buried in mud near a cypress knee, the fabric rotted but still intact enough to recognize. Inside was a wallet belonging to someone named Caleb, with an ID dated 1987. There was also a waterlogged journal with a single legible entry. The trees won't let me leave. They want to watch. That's all they've ever wanted. To watch us, to study us, to remember us. I think I'm going to let them. I found 3 more backpacks that day, scattered throughout the bayou. Different names, different decades. The most recent was from 2019, belonging to someone named Naomi. Her journal had dozens of entries about the watching trees, documenting the same progression I'd experienced, first noticing the faces, then realizing they moved, then accepting that escape wasn't possible. Her final entry said, "I understand now. They're not hostile. They're curious. We spend so much time studying nature, cataloging it, observing it. The trees are just doing the same to us. It seems only fair." I'm on my 6th day now. My satellite phone stopped working yesterday. Not broken, just silent, like something is blocking the signal. I could probably still force my way out if I tried hard enough, if I ignored the faces and pushed through the psychological barrier they've created. But Naomi was right. This is fair. I've spent my entire adult life observing plants, documenting them, studying their secrets. The trees have every right to do the same to me. The faces are closer now. Some have appeared on trees only a few feet from my tent. New ones are forming, or maybe I'm just seeing ones that were always there. Last night, I noticed something that should have terrified me, but instead felt oddly comforting. One of the faces looks like mine. Same bone structure, same eyes, same expression I make when I'm concentrating. The tree is growing me into its bark, making me permanent, turning me from observer into observed. I've stopped trying to document the orchids. Instead, I'm documenting the trees, photographing every face I can find, recording their positions and expressions. It's what they want, I think. To be seen, to be acknowledged, to have someone recognize that they're not just background scenery, but active participants in the forest. They watch because they want to be watched in return. My food will run out in 3 days. After that, I'll have to make a choice. Leave or stay. But I already know what I'm going to do. There are worse fates than being remembered by something ancient and patient. The trees have been watching humans for millennia, collecting us in their bark like we collect pressed flowers in books. I'll be one more face among hundreds, one more observation in their endless study. And honestly, after spending my whole life looking at plants, maybe it's time I let them look back. If you stumbled upon proof that something evil was still happening in the wilderness, would you investigate or run? What if running was no longer possible? Some places in the swamp aren't meant to be found, and the things that happen there don't stop just because you've witnessed them. My name is Holden, and I've been a survival instructor for 15 years. I've trained military personnel, law enforcement, corporate groups, anyone who needs to know how to stay alive in hostile environments. I'm not someone who scares easily. I've dealt with bears, snakes, dangerous weather, and every natural threat you can imagine. But what I encountered in the Mississippi Delta wasn't natural, and it sure as hell wasn't a threat I was trained to handle. I was leading a 4-day advanced survival course with 6 clients. The route took us deep into the Delta's backwaters, through areas most people never see. Dense cypress forests, stagnant pools, channels so narrow you have to turn sideways to squeeze through. It's challenging terrain, which is exactly what my clients paid for. On the second day, around mid-afternoon, we came across an island that shouldn't have been there. I'd run this route maybe 20 times over the years. I knew every landmark, every campsite, every potential hazard. This island wasn't on my GPS, wasn't on my maps, and I'd never seen it before. It was small, maybe 50 feet across, rising about 6 feet above the waterline. The vegetation was different too. Instead of the usual tupelo and cypress, it was covered in some kind of twisted scrub brush that looked half dead. But what caught my attention were the bones. They covered the island like snow. Hundreds of them, thousands maybe. Skulls, ribs, femurs, vertebrae, all sizes, all species. Most were clearly animal bones, deer, raccoons, birds, alligators. But scattered among them were bones that looked disturbingly human. And they weren't randomly scattered. They were arranged in patterns, geometric designs that radiated out from the center of the island like a mandala made of death. My clients were excited, chattering about what could have caused this. Natural die-off, they suggested, flooding that concentrated animal remains, maybe an old Native American burial site. I didn't correct them, but I knew better. Natural processes don't arrange bones in perfect circles and spirals. This was deliberate. Someone or something had collected these bones and placed them with intention and care. I told the group we'd investigate briefly and then move on. I didn't like the feeling of the place. The air was wrong. Too still, too quiet. Even the insects had stopped buzzing. We waded through the shallow water and climbed onto the island. The bones crunched under our feet, and the sound echoed wrong, like the island was hollow underneath. As we spread out to examine the patterns, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The patterns were moving, not dramatically, not obviously, but between glances, bones had shifted position. I'd look at a skull, look away to warn the group to stay together, and look back to find the skull rotated a few degrees. A circle of ribs would be slightly larger. A spiral would have tightened. I didn't say anything yet. I needed to be sure I wasn't seeing things. But then one of my clients, a guy named Israel, called out that he'd found something. In the center of the island was a depression, like a shallow bowl. Israel was standing at the edge, pointing down into it. The bowl was filled with more bones, but these were different. They were fresh. Some still had tissue attached, and they were arranged in the shape of a person, a bone sculpture of a human figure, lying on its back with arms spread wide. The skull at the top of the figure was definitely human. So were the long bones forming the arms and legs. I immediately ordered everyone off the island. This wasn't a historical site or a natural phenomenon. This was recent, active, and possibly dangerous. But as we turned to leave, we realized the water around the island had changed. When we'd arrived, it had been maybe 2 feet deep. Now it was at least 5 feet, and it was still rising. The island was growing, expanding outward, and the water around it was getting deeper, like the land was sinking around us. One of my clients, a woman named Sadie, started panicking. The water was rising fast enough to see it moving, lapping higher on the trunks of nearby trees. I tried the radio, but got only static. My GPS was spinning, unable to lock onto satellites. My compass was pointing in impossible directions, at one point showing north in 3 different places simultaneously. The island had us cut off from reality somehow. Then the bones started moving for real. Not subtle shifts, but active movement. The patterns began to rotate around the center depression, spiraling inward like water going down a drain. The bones clicked and clattered against each other, creating a sound like rattling chains. The figure in the center depression sat up. It wasn't alive. There was no flesh, no muscle, just bones held together by nothing visible. But it moved with purpose, turning its skull to look at each of us in turn. My training said to assess threats and respond appropriately. But my training had never covered the animated skeletons on impossible islands in rising water. Israel screamed and tried to jump off the island. He made it about 3 feet before something grabbed his ankle. A hand made of small bones, finger bones, toe bones, fragments fused together, had emerged from the pattern and wrapped around his leg. He fell hard, and more bone hands reached up from the pattern, grabbing his arms, his other leg, his torso. We tried to pull him free, but the hands were strong, far stronger than bones should be. They dragged Israel across the island toward the center depression. He was screaming, fighting. But there were too many hands now, dozens of them, all pulling him inexorably toward that bowl where the bone figure had been. The figure itself was standing now, watching with empty eye sockets as Israel was dragged closer. Sadie grabbed a large femur and started beating at the bone hands, shattering some of them. But for every one she broke, two more emerged from the pattern. The other clients were frozen in terror, and I was trying to think of anything from my training that applied. I pulled out my survival knife and started cutting at the bone hands, but the blade just bounced off them like they were made of steel instead of calcium. Israel was pulled into the depression, and the bone hands began arranging him. Not killing him, arranging him. They stripped off his clothes and positioned his living body into the same spread eagle pose the bone figure had been in. He was still alive, still screaming, but he couldn't move. The hands held him perfectly still while other bones began to gather around him, creating a new pattern with him at its center. The bone figure walked toward us. Its movement was jerky but purposeful, like it was remembering how human locomotion worked. When it spoke, the sound came from everywhere and nowhere, a voice made of wind through hollow spaces. The island remembers, the island preserves. You found us, so you stay. You become part of the pattern. It's been this way for longer than your kind has had words. I grabbed Sadie and the other 3 clients and pulled them to the edge of the island. The water was now 8 feet deep, but I'd rather risk drowning than whatever was happening to Israel. We jumped. The water was ice cold despite the heat of the day, and it tasted of metal and rot. We swam hard for the nearest trees, maybe 30 yards away. Behind us, Israel's screaming had stopped. I didn't look back. We made it to the trees and pulled ourselves up onto a large fallen log. When I finally looked back at the island, it was larger, at least twice the size it had been. And I could see new patterns forming on its surface, spiraling out from 2 center points now. Israel was part of the pattern, his body positioned among the bones. He wasn't moving. I don't know if he was dead or just frozen by whatever force controlled the island. We spent the next 6 hours making our way out of that section of the delta, moving from log to log, avoiding the water as much as possible. The island followed us. I'd look back and it would be in a different position, always about 100 yards away, always oriented so that its patterns faced our direction. It was tracking us, herding us, waiting for us to tire and make a mistake. We finally reached an area with solid ground and half ran, half stumbled out of the swamp. When we hit the gravel road where our vehicles were parked, I looked back one last time. The island was at the edge of the tree line, as close as it could get to the road without leaving the water. The patterns were still visible, and I could see 3 figures standing on it now. 2 were definitely bone figures. The third looked like Israel, but wrong somehow. Too still, too pale. I reported Israel missing, told the authorities he'd fallen through rotted wood into deep water and we couldn't recover the body. They searched for 3 days and found nothing. No island, no bone patterns, nothing unusual. The other 4 clients backed up my story without me asking them to. We all understood that the truth wouldn't help Israel and would only make us sound insane. But I know the island is still there, still growing, still collecting. I've been back to that area 3 times now, always alone, always at night. I can't help it. Something pulls me back, makes me want to see if it's grown. And it has. Each time I return, the island is larger, the patterns more complex. Last week, I counted 7 figures standing on it, all perfectly still, all watching the shore. One of them waved at me. It was Israel, or what Israel had become, part of the pattern, part of the preservation, part of whatever ancient thing lives in that island and remembers everything it collects. I'm writing this as a warning, or maybe as a confession. I'm going back tonight. The pull is too strong now. I dream about the patterns, about finding my place in them, about becoming part of something that remembers. The island knows my name now. I can hear it whispered in the wind, called out by voices made of hollow bones and empty spaces. Israel is waiting for me. The pattern has a space reserved, right next to his. And honestly, after weeks of fighting the pull, I'm tired of resisting. Some things in the swamp don't let you leave. Some things collect you, preserve you, make you permanent. Tonight, I become part of the pattern. Tomorrow, maybe I'll wave at the next person who finds the island. Maybe it'll be someone I know. What lies beneath the bottom of a swamp? What would you do if you discovered there was no bottom at all, just deeper and deeper darkness? Sometimes the most terrifying thing about searching for the lost is finding out where they went. I'm a rescue diver. My name is Cruz, and for the past 11 years, I've pulled people out of places they shouldn't have been. Flooded caves, sunken vehicles, collapsed structures. I've seen bodies in every state of decomposition, dealt with grieving families, and learned to compartmentalize trauma in ways that probably aren't healthy. But I've always been able to do my job because I understood the physics of it. Water has rules. Depth has limits. Even the worst recoveries made sense within those parameters. Then I got called to the mobile Tensaw Delta in Alabama, and every rule I understood stopped applying. The call came in on a Tuesday. A fisherman named Angelo had gone missing 3 days prior in a remote section of the Delta. His boat was found anchored in about 12 feet of water, engine off, no signs of struggle. His fishing gear was still in the boat. His phone was still in the boat. Angelo was just gone. The family insisted he was an experienced waterman who wouldn't have fallen overboard accidentally. But the police had no evidence of foul play. They wanted me to search the bottom, see if maybe he'd had a medical emergency and fallen in. I arrived at the site on Wednesday morning with my partner, Caden. The water was typical Delta. Murky, tannin-stained, visibility maybe 6 inches on a good day. The bottom was supposed to be 12 feet down, soft mud and vegetation, standard recovery conditions. We geared up, ran through our safety checks, and I went in first, while Caden managed my line from the boat. The descent was normal until about 8 feet. That's when I saw the first mark. It was carved into a cypress root that extended down from a submerged tree, a horizontal line with numbers next to it. 10 ft from surface. The carving looked old, weathered by water but still clearly visible. I made a mental note and continued down. At 10 feet, I found another mark on a different route. 15 ft from surface. That didn't make sense. I was only at 10 feet, but the mark said 15. I checked my depth gauge. It read 10 feet exactly. I was about to dismiss the mark as some kind of prank when I reached what should have been the bottom, except there was no bottom. My gauge said 12 feet, but below me was just more water, darker, colder. I could see more roots extending down, and on each root were more marks, each claiming to be deeper than the last. I radioed Caden. Bottom's not where it should be. Going deeper to investigate. His response was garbled, like interference, but I thought I heard him acknowledge. I descended further. At 15 feet, I found a mark that said 25 ft from surface. At 20 feet, the mark said 40 ft from surface. The discrepancy between my gauge and the marks was growing. More concerning, the roots around me were forming something like a tunnel, narrowing as I went deeper, creating natural walls that channeled me downward. At 30 feet, according to my gauge, I found something that made me stop. A diver's weight belt hung carefully on a root next to a mark that read 50 ft from surface. The belt had a name tag, Chen, 2003. I knew that name. Chen had been a rescue diver who disappeared in this area 20 years ago. They'd searched for weeks and found nothing. Now here was his belt, hung like a trophy or a warning. I should have surfaced right then. Protocol said to report findings and reassess. But I could see more objects below, more belts, masks, fins, all hung on roots at regular intervals, marking a path downward. Each item had a name and date. Some were recent. One was from last month. And the marks kept going, claiming depths that couldn't possibly exist in this section of the delta. I continued down. My gauge read 40 feet. The mark next to me said 80 FT from surface. The water was much colder now, and the pressure felt wrong, too intense for the depth my instruments claimed. The root tunnel was tighter, just barely wide enough for me to fit through. And ahead of me, I could see light. Not sunlight filtering from above, but artificial light, like flashlights or lanterns coming from below. At 50 feet by my gauge, 100 feet according to the marks, I found Angelo. He was alive. He was sitting cross-legged on a root platform, his eyes open, staring down into the depths below. He wasn't wearing dive gear. He wasn't breathing from a tank. He was just sitting there underwater, somehow alive, somehow breathing water like air. When my light hit him, he slowly turned his head to look at me. His mouth moved, and I heard his voice through the water, clear as if we were standing on land. Don't go up. There's nothing up there anymore. Down is the only direction that matters now. I grabbed him, tried to pull him toward the surface. He didn't resist, but he also didn't help. He was limp, passive, like a mannequin. As I started ascending with him, he spoke again. You're going the wrong way. The surface isn't where you think it is. The marks know the truth. Your instruments are lying. My gauge said I was at 50 feet and rising. But as I ascended, I passed marks that claimed I was going deeper. 60 feet, 70 feet, 80 feet. The numbers were increasing as I went up. That was impossible. I kicked harder, pulling Angelo with me. The root tunnel seemed longer on the way up than it had been going down. My air was running low. I'd been down too long, used too much searching. At what my gauge claimed was 20 feet, I looked down and saw them. Dozens of divers, maybe more, all sitting on root platforms at various depths below me, all staring upward. Some were in modern gear. Others wore equipment from decades past. All of them were motionless, just watching me ascend. And beyond them, deeper in the tunnel, I could see the lights. They weren't flashlights. They were too steady, too permanent. They looked like windows, like there was something down there with rooms and structure and habitation. Angelo started struggling, not to go up, but to go back down. He twisted in my grip, reaching toward the depths, toward the watching divers. I found it, he said. I found where the bottom really is. It's not up. It's not down. It's inside. The marks measure the truth, distance from the surface of understanding. You're still at zero. You haven't even started descending yet. I lost my grip on him. He slipped free and sank, not falling fast like a body should, but drifting gently, peacefully, like he was being lowered by invisible hands. He settled onto a root platform about 40 feet below me, by my gauge, and sat cross-legged like the others. He turned his face up to me one last time and smiled. Then he looked down, toward the lights, and stopped moving. I surfaced. Or at least I thought I did. I broke through water into air, but it was wrong. The sky was wrong, too dark for midday. The boat was wrong. It looked older, weathered. Caden was gone. In his place was someone else, someone I didn't recognize, holding my safety line and looking at me with an expression of deep sadness. How long was I down? I asked. The stranger checked a watch and said, 3 hours. Same as all the others. You found the marks, didn't you? You went deep enough to see the truth. I looked at my dive computer. It said I'd been down for 15 minutes. My air gauge said I had half a tank left. But my body felt like I'd been underwater for hours. Cold, exhausted, pressured. The stranger helped me into the boat and told me his name was Shepard. He said he was a researcher studying disappearances in the Delta. He'd been documenting the marks for 5 years, trying to understand what they measured. It's not water depth, he explained. It's something else. Distance from consensus reality, maybe. Or depth of understanding. The further down you go, the more you see things as they really are rather than how we agree they should be. He showed me a journal filled with names and dates. Every diver who disappeared in this area going back to 1967. Hundreds of names. And next to each name was a depth measurement, but not in feet or meters. The measurements were in something else, symbols I didn't recognize. They're all still down there, Shepard said, sitting in the roots, watching the descent, waiting for the next person to find the marks and follow them down. I should have reported this, should have called authorities, demanded investigations. But when I got back to shore and tried to tell people what I'd seen, they looked at me like I'd suffered nitrogen narcosis or decompression sickness. My dive computer showed a normal dive. 15 minutes at a maximum depth of 30 feet. There was no evidence of the tunnel, the marks, the watching divers. Angelo was still, officially missing. And I had nothing to show for the search except hypothermia and exhaustion that shouldn't have been possible from such a short, shallow dive. But I know what I saw. I know the marks are real. And I know that somewhere beneath the mobile Tensaw Delta, there's a place where depth stops being a measurement of distance and becomes a measurement of something else entirely. A place where the bottom isn't the bottom, where down goes on forever, where lost divers sit and watch and wait. I've been back 4 times. Each time, I see the marks clearly. Each time, I descend a little further. Each time, Angelo waves at me from his root platform and points deeper, toward the lights. Last week, I measured the marks with a camera, tried to document them. But in every photo, they just look like natural root formations. The numbers don't show up. The carvings look like random weathering. Tonight, I'm going back with enough air to reach the lights. Shepard tried to stop me, said that no one who reaches the lights has ever come back. But I need to know what they are. I need to understand what the marks are really measuring. I need to find out where the bottom actually is. My gauge will say I'm at 60 feet. The marks will say I'm at 200. And somewhere between those two measurements is the truth. I just have to descend deep enough to find it. Angelo is waiting. The lights are calling. And I'm finally ready to learn what depth really means. What would you do if you heard your own future death being broadcast? Could you change it? Or would you be living out someone else's already recorded nightmare? Time doesn't move the same way in isolated places. And sometimes the past refuses to stay buried. My name is Scarlett. And 3 months ago, I took what I thought was a dream job. Solo park ranger at a remote outpost in North Carolina's Pocassin wetlands. The position offered solitude, decent pay, and a chance to escape a life that had fallen apart in every way that mattered. The station was a small concrete building surrounded by miles of acidic bogs, carnivorous plants, and stunted trees that looked like they'd given up trying to grow. It was perfect for someone who wanted to disappear. I just didn't realize I'd be disappearing in more ways than one. The previous ranger, a woman named Maya, had left suddenly according to the district supervisor. No notice, no explanation. just packed up in the middle of her shift and drove away. They found her truck abandoned at a rest stop 200 miles away. She'd left everything, her personal belongings, her documentation, even her phone. They never found her. The supervisor seemed uncomfortable talking about it, rushing through the orientation and leaving me alone in the station by mid-afternoon. The station was basic. One main room with a desk and monitoring equipment, a small kitchen, a bathroom, and a bedroom. The radio was old, probably from the 80s, a big console unit with analog dials and a crackling speaker. My job was simple: monitor weather conditions, document wildlife observations, and check in with the district office twice daily. The rest of the time was mine. It seemed impossibly easy. The first 3 days were exactly what I'd hoped for. Quiet, peaceful. The Pocosin stretched out in every direction, a flat expanse of wetland that looked hostile to human life. Venus flytraps and pitcher plants dotted the landscape, and the water in the drainage ditches was the color of tea, stained brown by decaying vegetation. At night, the silence was absolute. No traffic sounds, no neighbors, no signs of civilization. Just me, the station, and the endless bog. On the 4th night, the radio started acting strange. It was after midnight, and I was reading in bed when I heard voices coming from the main room. I walked out to find the radio on, even though I'd turned it off hours before. The voices were faint, buried under layers of static, but they sounded like official communications. Weather reports, check-ins, routine ranger business. I assumed it was picking up transmissions from other stations and turned it off again. It came back on 10 minutes later. This time the voices were clearer, and I recognized the format. It was a ranger doing a check-in, using proper radio protocol, reporting conditions at a Pocosin station. The voice was female, young, professional. She was reporting normal conditions, nothing unusual, signing off for the night. Then the static cleared completely, and I heard her say something that made my blood go cold. "This is Ranger Maya Thompson, Station 7, signing off. October 18th, 2023. That was 18 months ago. And Maya was the ranger who disappeared from the station. I grabbed my own radio log and checked the date she'd left. October 19th, 2023. The day after this broadcast. I was hearing her final check-in, somehow delayed, playing back through equipment that shouldn't be capable of recording anything. I tried to respond, keying the microphone and asking if anyone could hear me. The radio went dead silent, not even static. Then it crackled back to life, and I heard Maya's voice again, but different this time. Not professional and calm, frightened, confused. "This is Ranger Thompson. I need assistance at Station 7. I'm receiving broadcasts that shouldn't be possible. They're describing my location, my actions, my thoughts. Someone is watching me. Someone is broadcasting everything I do. Please respond." No one responded. Just silence. Then her voice came back, more panicked. "They're broadcasting tomorrow. They're telling me what I'm going to do tomorrow, every detail, every decision. I can hear my own voice describing actions I haven't taken yet. How is this possible? How do they know?" The radio cut out. I sat at the desk, hands shaking, trying to rationalize what I'd heard. Old recordings, somehow stored in the equipment. Atmospheric conditions causing strange transmission echoes. Anything but the obvious explanation. That I was hearing Maya's final days playing out in real time, 18 months after they'd happened. The next night, the broadcasts started earlier. I heard Maya's voice at sunset, reporting her daily observations. But mixed in with the routine reports were desperate messages. begging for help, describing broadcasts she was hearing that predicted her future. She talked about hearing herself scream, hearing herself beg for her life, hearing herself go silent. All in broadcasts dated for days that hadn't happened yet from her perspective. Then I heard something that made me drop the coffee mug I was holding. Maya's voice, clear and steady, saying, October 25th. The new ranger arrives today. Her name is Scarlet. She seems nice, quiet, running from something. She doesn't know what this place does yet. She doesn't know the station records everything, not just what happens, but what will happen. The radio doesn't broadcast, it predicts. And once you hear your own future, you can't change it. You can only live it out exactly as broadcast. That was impossible. Maya had disappeared 18 months ago. I'd arrived 4 days ago. She couldn't have known my name, couldn't have described me. But she had. And now I understood what had happened to her. She'd heard her own future broadcast, heard herself leaving, heard herself abandoning her truck at a rest stop. And she'd done exactly that, unable to deviate from the script the radio had already written. I tried to leave that night. Got in my truck, started the engine, made it maybe a quarter mile down the access road. Then I stopped. I don't know why. My hands just turned the wheel around, and I drove back to the station. When I walked inside, the radio was on, and I heard my own voice. I tried to leave tonight. Made it a quarter mile, came back, just like the broadcast said I would. That's when I started hearing my own future. Every night, the radio would come alive with transmissions dated days, weeks, sometimes months ahead. All in my voice. All describing my actions, my thoughts, my slow descent into the same trap that had caught Maya. I heard myself trying to call for help and getting no answer. I heard myself attempting to destroy the radio and failing. I heard myself eventually accepting that the future was fixed, that the broadcasts were inevitable. The worst broadcast came last week, dated for tonight. I've been dreading it, but I couldn't stop myself from listening. My own voice, calm and resigned, describing my final act. November 15th. I understand now what the station really is. It's not a ranger outpost. It's a recording device. It captures time, stores it, plays it back out of sequence. Maya is still here. All the previous rangers are still here, trapped in broadcasts that play on infinite loops. We're all here all the time, living our pasts and futures simultaneously. Tonight I join them permanently. Tonight I become part of the transmission. The broadcast described exactly how I would do it, where I would go, what I would say, how I would walk into the Pocosin at midnight and let the bog take me, just like all the others. And here's the terrible thing. I know I'm going to do exactly that. I've spent the last week trying to change it, trying to do anything different from what the broadcast predicted. But every action I take, every decision I make, matches the transmission perfectly. It's 11:45 now. In 15 minutes, according to the broadcast, I'll put down this pen. I've been writing this in my logbook, just like the broadcast said I would. I'll stand up, walk to the door, and step outside. I'll walk north into the Pocosin, into the acidic water and carnivorous plants. I'll keep walking until the bog closes over my head. And I'll do it calmly, peacefully, because the broadcast says that's how I do it. The radio is on now. It's playing tomorrow's transmissions. I can hear the district supervisor arriving to find the station empty. I can hear them searching for me. I can hear them finding this log book and reading these exact words. I can hear them assigning a new ranger, someone named Zoe. And I can hear her arrival broadcast already queued up, ready to play. She seems nice in the transmissions. Energetic, optimistic. She has no idea what's waiting for her. It's 11:58. Time to stand up. Time to walk to the door. Time to fulfill the broadcast. I want to fight it. Want to prove that the future isn't fixed, that I have free will. But my legs are moving. My hand is reaching for the doorknob. My feet are carrying me outside. The Poccasin is beautiful in the moonlight. The pitcher plants are open, waiting. The water is still and dark. I can hear the radio behind me, already broadcasting next week. Already describing Zoe's arrival, already predicting her future. I'm walking north now. The water is at my ankles, my knees, my waist. It's cold and acidic, but I don't feel it. I only hear the broadcast, my own voice in my head, describing this moment with perfect accuracy. The water is at my chest now, my shoulders, my neck. This is the last line I'll think before the broadcast ends. The station never lets you go. It just keeps replaying your loop forever. Maya is still here. I'll be here too. And Zoe will join us soon. The water is over my head now. The broadcast continues without me. It always does. If you saw yourself in a reflection doing terrible things, would it be a warning or a prophecy? What happens when the reflection decides it wants to be real? In Virginia's Great Dismal Swamp, the line between what is and what could be becomes dangerously thin. I'm a documentary filmmaker named Avery, and I came to the Great Dismal Swamp to capture something beautiful. I'd spent 2 years pitching a nature series about America's forgotten wetlands, and I'd finally gotten funding for a pilot episode. The swamp seemed perfect, atmospheric, historically significant, visually stunning. I arrived with top-tier camera equipment, 3 weeks of supplies, and a vision for something that would launch my career. I'm leaving with footage I'll never show anyone and an understanding of reality that I wish I could forget. Lake Drummond sits at the heart of the Great Dismal Swamp, a perfectly circular body of water surrounded by ancient cypress and tupelo. The lake is shallow, rarely more than 6 feet deep, and the water is remarkably still. On calm days, it creates mirror-perfect reflections of the sky and surrounding forest. That reflective quality was exactly what I wanted to capture. The blurring of boundaries between water and air, earth and sky, real and reflected. I set up my base camp on the lake's southern shore and spent the first week filming standard nature footage. Sunrises over still water, birds skimming the surface, mist rolling across at dawn. Beautiful, professional, exactly what my producers wanted. The first anomaly appeared on day 8. I was reviewing footage from that morning when I noticed something in one of the reflection shots. I'd filmed the tree line reflected in the lake, and everything looked normal except for one detail. In the reflection, I was visible standing on the shore. But when I'd filmed that shot, I'd been 50 feet back from the water, operating the camera on a tripod. There was no way I should have been in the frame. I checked the timestamp, checked my notes. I definitely hadn't been standing at the shore during that shot. But there I was in the reflection, clear as day, standing at the water's edge, looking down into the lake. I assumed it was some kind of lens flare or double exposure, even though my camera didn't work that way. I moved on. But the next day, I caught it happening in real time. I was filming from the shore, camera pointed down at the water, capturing the reflection of clouds moving overhead. In the viewfinder, I saw myself appear in the reflection. Not where I actually was. I was behind the camera, but standing directly in front of it, knee-deep in the water, staring down at my own reflection. pulled my eye away from the viewfinder and looked at the actual lake. Nothing there, just empty water. But in the viewfinder, reflection me remained. Perfectly clear, perfectly still. I stopped filming and walked to the water's edge, looking down at the surface. My reflection looked normal, exactly, matching my position and posture. I waved my hand. My reflection waved back. Perfect synchronization. I was being paranoid. The stress of the project, the isolation, the pressure to deliver something extraordinary. It was making me see things that weren't there. I went back to camp and decided to take the rest of the day off. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the figure in the reflection, the way it had been standing in the water, the way it had been looking down instead of at the camera. Around 2 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and walked down to the lake with a flashlight. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the stars with impossible clarity. I shined my light down at the surface and saw my reflection looking back up at me. Normal, expected. Then my reflection smiled. I wasn't smiling. My face was neutral, tired, concerned, but my reflection was smiling, wide and genuine, like it was happy to see me. I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. When I picked it up and pointed it back at the water, my reflection was normal again, matching my expression of fear perfectly. I ran back to camp and didn't come out of my tent until sunrise. In the morning light, everything seemed ridiculous. Reflections can't smile independently. It was a trick of the light, exhaustion, my imagination filling in details that weren't there. I made coffee, ate breakfast, and convinced myself to continue filming. But the reflections kept being wrong. Over the next 3 days, I captured hours of footage, and in every single shot that included the lake's surface, there were discrepancies. Reflections that moved differently than their sources. Reflected trees that had different branch arrangements than the real trees. Reflected sky that showed different cloud formations. And increasingly, reflections of me doing things I wasn't doing. Reflection me walking into the water. Reflection me diving beneath the surface. Reflection me standing at the lake's center. Somehow not sinking, just standing on top of the water, looking back at the shore. On day 12, I saw reflection me doing something that made my hands go numb. I was filming a wide shot of the lake at sunset, camera locked on a tripod, me standing 10 feet back reviewing the shot composition on my monitor. On the screen, I watched reflection me, standing at the water's edge in the reflected world. Pick up a large rock and smash it into the head of real me. Except real me was standing right there next to the camera, unharmed. But in the reflection, I watched myself collapse. Watched blood spread across the reflected shore, watched reflection me drag my body into the water. I stopped the recording and ran to the lake's edge, looking down. The reflection showed the normal sunset scene. No body, no blood, no violence. But when I played back the footage, it was all there, captured in perfect high definition. Reflection me committing murder on real me. I had video evidence of my own death, carried out by my own reflection. That night, the reflection started showing me different timelines. I'd look at the lake and see myself from different angles, different moments, different decisions. In one reflection, I was packing up my equipment and leaving. In another, I was setting up more cameras, obsessively documenting the phenomenon. In another, I was wading into the lake, fully clothed, walking deeper until the water closed over my head. Each reflection was a different possible future, a different version of events branching out from this moment. I started testing the reflections, trying to understand the rules. I'd make a decision, raise my left hand instead of my right, and watch the reflections change. Some versions of me raised their left hand, others raised their right. Some didn't raise their hand at all, but walked into the water instead. The lake was showing me every possible version of myself. Every decision I could make, every outcome that could follow. And increasingly, more and more reflections were showing me walking into the water. Like the probability was shifting, like that outcome was becoming more likely with each passing moment. On day 15, I met one of my reflections face to face. I was standing at the water's edge filming the sunset when I saw reflection me surface from beneath the water. Not my normal reflection, a different me, one from one of the alternate timelines. She was soaking wet, gasping for air, looking around frantically. Then she saw me, real me, standing on the shore. Our eyes met across the boundary between reflection and reality. She reached up toward me, her hand pressing against the water's surface from below like it was pressing against glass. And I heard her voice, muffled and distorted, but clearly audible. Don't become a reflection. Once you're on this side, you can't get back. I dropped my camera and backed away from the water. The reflected version of me kept pounding against the surface, trying to break through. Behind her, I could see other reflected versions of myself. Dozens of them, all underwater, all trying to surface, all trapped in the reflection world. Some looked like they'd been there for days. Others looked like they'd been there much longer, pale, deteriorated, but still moving, still trying to escape. I haven't filmed anything since then. That was 3 days ago. I've been sitting in my camp, too afraid to look at the lake, too afraid to even glance at any reflective surface. But the problem is, I don't need to look at the lake anymore. The reflections are appearing everywhere. In my coffee, in the screen of my turned-off phone, in the lens of my camera. Everywhere I look, I see versions of myself, and more of them are on the wrong side of the reflection. This morning, I noticed something that confirmed my worst fear. I looked at my hands and saw that I was slightly translucent, like I wasn't completely solid anymore. I held my hand up to block the sun, and I could see light coming through my skin. I'm becoming a reflection. The real me is still somewhere in the real world, and I'm the version that crossed over without realizing it. I don't know when it happened. Was it when I stared too long at the lake? When I touched the water? When I made eye contact with that drowned version of myself? I've been trying to remember which side of the reflection I started on. But the memories are confused, layered, showing me multiple versions of the same events. I can see her now, real me, on the shore, packing up equipment, getting ready to leave. She looks solid, completely opaque, completely real. She's doing exactly what I should be doing, what I thought I was doing. But I'm not on the shore anymore. I'm in the reflection, translucent and fading, just another alternate timeline that didn't quite happen the way it should have. She's walking toward the water now, real me, probably to get one last shot before leaving. She's holding the camera, pointing it down at the lake. In a moment, she'll see me in the viewfinder. She'll see this version of herself, the one that became a reflection, the one that got trapped on the wrong side of the water. And she'll do what I did, drop the camera, back away in horror, convince herself it isn't real. But it is real. I'm real, as real as she is. We're just on different sides now. She's solid and I'm reflected. She's leaving and I'm staying. She'll go on to make her documentary, launch her career, live the life I was supposed to live. And I'll stay here in the reflection, one more alternate version among dozens. All of us trapped in timelines that almost happened but didn't quite make it to reality. She sees me now. Our eyes meet. I'm pressing my hand against the surface from below, just like the drowned version did to me. I'm trying to warn her, trying to tell her to run, to never come back, to forget about the Great Dismal Swamp and its impossible reflections. But I can see in her eyes that she's already making the same mistakes I made. She's curious. She's fascinated. She's reaching down toward the water, wanting to touch the surface, wanting to make contact with this strange reflection that looks so real and so wrong simultaneously. Don't do it. I try to scream, but my voice doesn't carry across the boundary. All she hears is her own voice, distorted and distant, calling to her from beneath the water. Her fingers touch the surface. I feel myself becoming more solid. She begins to fade. The exchange is happening. Real becomes reflection. Reflection becomes real. And the lake continues to mirror, to multiply, to trap every possible version of every person who looks too long into its perfect, terrible surface. What if the ground beneath your feet was alive and hungry? How would you run when every step sinks you deeper into something that wants to consume you? In Arkansas's Bayou Bartholomew, the oldest and longest bayou in the world, something ancient has been waiting beneath the mud for longer than humans have walked the earth. They call me Mila, and I'm an environmental scientist who spent 7 years studying soil composition in wetland ecosystems. I understand dirt at a molecular level. Its chemistry, its biology, its physical properties. I can tell you the pH of mud by touching it, can identify bacterial colonies by smell, can predict erosion patterns by examining sediment layers. I thought I knew everything about soil. Then I spent 5 days taking samples in Bayou Bartholomew, and I learned that sometimes dirt knows more about you than you know about it. The project was straightforward. Collect soil samples from 20 locations along a 12-mile stretch of the bayou, analyze them for contamination, and provide recommendations for ecosystem restoration. I was working alone, which was normal for this type of survey. I had a small motorboat, GPS coordinates for each sample site, and enough equipment to keep me busy for a week. The bayou was beautiful in that way, only ancient waterways can be. Massive cypress trees with trunks like cathedral columns, oxbow lakes that curved through the landscape like liquid question marks, and mud. So much mud. Black, rich, organic mud that squished between your toes and smelled like life and death happening simultaneously. The first 3 days went perfectly. I collected samples, documented conditions, took photographs. The mud behaved exactly as mud should, sticky, anaerobic, full of decomposing organic matter. But on the 4th day, at my 14th sample site, I noticed something unusual. The mud was warm, not sun-warmed. The site was completely shaded by cypress canopy. But when I pushed my coring tool into the sediment, it came out hot to the touch, maybe 85 or 90 degrees. That was wrong. Bayou mud should be cool, especially in shade. I took the temperature with a probe. 87 degrees at the surface, 92 degrees 6 inches down. That was impossible without a geothermal heat source. And this area had no volcanic activity, no hot springs, nothing that should produce that kind of warmth. I made detailed notes and moved to the next site. The mud there was even warmer, 95 degrees at the surface, touching 100 just inches below. And it felt different when I touched it. Not just warm, but somehow yielding in a way that felt less like touching dirt and more like touching skin. At the 16th site, I felt the mud move. I was kneeling at the water's edge, my hands submerged in the sediment, when I felt something that could only be described as a pulse. Rhythmic, steady, about 50 beats per minute. I pulled my hands out and stared at the mud. It looked completely normal, dark, wet, textured with bits of organic debris. But when I placed my palm flat on the surface, I felt it again. A pulse. The mud was beating like a heart. I should have left right then. Any rational scientist would have documented the anomaly and called for a team with proper monitoring equipment. But I was fascinated. This was the kind of discovery that changed careers, that got published in major journals, that made names. I set up my equipment and started taking measurements. Temperature readings showed the warm spots were expanding, growing larger throughout the day. Seismic sensors I placed in the mud picked up regular vibrations, that pulse I'd felt, but occurring over a massive area, maybe hundreds of acres. The entire section of bayou floor was pulsing in unison, like one enormous organism. As the sun set, the pulsing increased in frequency. 50 beats per minute became 60, then 70. The mud grew warmer, and I started noticing something else. My equipment was sinking, not settling, but being pulled down. The tripod for my camera had been on solid ground, but now it was tilted, one leg submerged several inches deeper than the others. My cooler, which I'd set on a flat rock, was half buried. And my boat, which I'd pulled well up onto the shore, had somehow moved closer to the water, its stern now touching the mud. I tried to pull the boat back to higher ground, but it wouldn't budge. It wasn't stuck, it was being held. The mud around the stern had risen up slightly, creating a lip that wrapped over the boat's edge. When I tried to brush the mud away, it was warm and sticky, clinging to my hands like it didn't want to let go. I grabbed my equipment and decided to leave immediately. But when I stepped toward my boat, my foot sank into the mud. Deep. Past my ankle, past my calf, halfway to my knee before I could stop my momentum. The mud was hot now, almost uncomfortably so. And it was tight around my leg, not just sticky but gripping, holding with what felt like muscular contractions. I tried to pull free but couldn't. I tried to dig around my trapped leg with my hands. But the mud I cleared away was immediately replaced by more mud flowing in from the sides. It was like trying to dig a hole in water. The hole filled itself faster than I could create it. Panic set in. I was alone, miles from help, with my leg being slowly pulled deeper into mud that was somehow alive. I could feel the pulse through my trapped limb, stronger now, faster, like the mud was excited. I grabbed a fallen branch and tried to use it as leverage, jamming it into the mud and pushing. The branch sank. I tried another. It sank too, pulled down by the same force holding my leg. That's when I noticed the other objects. All around me, partially buried in the mud, were things that shouldn't have been there. A backpack, newer style, maybe a few years old. A fishing rod. A metal tackle box. A boot that looked like it had been there much. Longer, the leather rotted but the shape still recognizable. And bones. Lots of bones. Ribs poking up like dead branches. A skull, face down, half submerged. These weren't ancient remains. Some of them still had tissue attached. The mud had pulled my leg deeper. I was now thigh deep, and I could feel the sediment working its way under my clothes, warm and invasive, touching skin that should never feel mud. The pulse was faster now, maybe 90 beats per minute, and I could hear it. A wet, rhythmic sound like breathing through fluid-filled lungs. The entire bayou floor was breathing, expanding and contracting, and I was sinking with each exhalation. I screamed for help, knowing no one would hear. The nearest road was 3 miles away. The nearest occupied building was farther than that. My radio was in the boat, which was now completely covered in mud. the whole vessel being slowly absorbed into the bayou floor. I watched as mud crept up the sides, over the seats, into the hull. Within 10 minutes, my boat was gone, pulled completely beneath the surface, leaving only ripples that smoothed away to nothing. I was waist-deep now. The heat was intense, like being in bath water that's too hot but you can't get out. The mud was moving against my skin, not flowing but moving deliberately, exploratory, like it was learning the shape of me. I could feel it working its way into my pockets, around my belt, under my shirt. And I could feel something else, a pulling sensation, not just downward, but inward, like the mud was trying to absorb me, to break me down into component parts. I remembered my sample cores, still in my bag, which was now half buried nearby. I lunged for it, pulling it free from the mud's grip with effort that felt like arm wrestling. Inside were the sealed sample tubes from earlier in the day. I held one up to the fading light and looked closely at the mud inside. It was moving, not settling or separating, but actually moving, flowing in patterns inside the sealed tube. And I could see things in it, shapes that looked like cells, but far too large to be bacterial. They looked almost like muscle fibers, contracting and relaxing in rhythm with the pulse I felt through the mud around me. The mud was at my chest now. I was breathing hard, fighting panic, trying to think of anything I'd learned in 7 years of soil science that might help. But nothing in my training covered carnivorous sediment. Nothing explained how an entire bayou floor could be a single living organism. Nothing prepared me for being eaten by the ground itself. My phone was somehow still in my shirt pocket. I pulled it out, amazed it hadn't been pulled down already. No signal, of course. But I opened the camera and took photos of the mud at my chest, of the breathing surface around me, of the bones and belongings of previous victims. If someone found my body, maybe they'd recover the phone. Maybe these photos would warn others. Then I noticed something in one photo that I hadn't seen with my eyes. In the mud around me, barely visible, were faces. Dozens of them, formed from sediment and organic matter, all watching me sink. They weren't human faces exactly, more like the idea of faces. The suggestion of features arranged in configurations that my brain interpreted as eyes and mouths. And they were all smiling. The mud reached my neck. It was getting harder to breathe. Not because it was covering my face yet, but because the pressure around my chest was immense. I could feel the pulse through my entire body now, feel my own heart synchronizing with it, beating in time with the mud's ancient rhythm. My vision was starting to blur. The heat was overwhelming. I was being digested, broken down, absorbed into something that had been feeding on anything that touched it for thousands of years. I'm writing this final message in my phone's notes app, holding it above the mud as long as I can. My shoulders are under now. My arms are tiring. Soon I won't be able to hold the phone up anymore. Soon it will sink with me, and these words will be pulled down into the breathing mud that covers the floor of Bayou Bartholomew. To whoever finds this, the mud is alive. It's warm because it has metabolism. It pulses because it has circulation. It pulls things down because it's hungry. Don't touch the warm spots. Don't take samples. Don't try to study it. Just mark this area as hazardous and stay away. The mud is at my chin now. I can taste it. Organic, rich, ancient. It tastes like the beginning of the world, like the primordial soup that life crawled out of billions of years ago. Maybe that's what this is. Maybe this mud never stopped being that soup. Maybe it's still creating life, still consuming and transforming, still hungry after all these millennia. My arms are shaking. I can't hold the phone up much longer. The mud is at my lower lip. I can feel it wanting to flow into my mouth, to fill me from the inside. The pulse is so fast now, maybe 200 beats per minute, excited, feeding, alive. I'm going under. The mud is warm. The darkness is complete. And beneath me, in the deep layers where no light has ever reached, I can feel others. All the people who sank before me. All the animals. All the living things that touched the breathing mud and couldn't escape. We're all still here, all still being digested, all becoming part of something older than memory. The mud is over my head now. It's breathing me in. What would you do if something ancient and unknowable tried to communicate with you? Would you answer? Or would you run knowing it's already seen you? On the coast of Georgia, where marsh meets ocean, there are questions that were never meant to be asked, and answers that should never be heard. My name is Claire, and I'm a maritime historian, specializing in abandoned lighthouse stations along the southeastern coast. For the past decade, I've been documenting these forgotten structures, preserving their stories before they crumble into the sea. Most are straightforward. Built in the 1800s, decommissioned in the mid-1900s, left to decay. But the Whitmore Light in coastal Georgia was different from the moment I found reference to it. Different because it shouldn't have existed at all. There were no official records of the Whitmore Light in any maritime database. No construction permits, no operational logs, no decommissioning orders. I only found it mentioned in a single journal entry from 1897, written by a keeper named Cody Morrison at a nearby station. His entry was brief and strange. Saw the answer light again tonight. Whitmore is still calling. I pray no one responds. That was it. No explanation, no context. Just those 2 sentences, and then his normal weather observations. I spent 6 months tracking down any information I could find. Census records showed no keeper ever assigned to a Whitmore Light. Maritime charts showed no lighthouse at any location that could match. But I found 3 more journal references from different keepers, all from the same era, all mentioning the Whitmore Light with the same unsettling reverence. They called it the Answer Light, and wrote about it always in hushed, frightened terms. One keeper wrote, "It responds to anything you ask. That's why it's dangerous. It knows answers that weren't meant for human understanding." I became obsessed. A lighthouse that answered questions, that responded to communication. It sounded like myth, like sailors' superstition. But the references were consistent across multiple independent sources. Someone had seen something in the Georgia marshlands, and they'd been terrified enough to document it while refusing to explain exactly what it was. I finally found its approximate location by cross-referencing the journal entries with historical maps. A section of marsh about 8 miles south of Brunswick, accessible only by shallow draft boat during high tide. The area was now part of a protected wildlife refuge, largely abandoned, visited by almost no one. Perfect conditions for a structure to be forgotten. I got the necessary permits, rented a boat, and went looking. I found it on my 3rd day of searching. The lighthouse rose from a small island of solid ground in the middle of vast sawgrass marshes, about 2 miles from open ocean. It was smaller than most lighthouses, maybe 40 feet tall, built from gray stone that looked far older than the 1800s. The tower was intact, but the keeper's house was gone, leaving only foundation stones. The lighthouse looked operational. The glass in the lantern room was unbroken, and I could see what looked like functioning equipment inside. I anchored my boat and waded through knee-deep tidal pools to reach the island. The lighthouse door was unlocked. Inside, a spiral staircase led upward through darkness that felt heavier than normal shadow. I climbed carefully, my flashlight beam showing walls covered in carved symbols. Not graffiti, but deliberate inscriptions that looked ancient. The symbols weren't in any alphabet I recognized. They looked more like mathematical equations or musical notation, precise and intentional. The lantern room at the top took my breath away. The Fresnel lens was still there, massive and intact. But it wasn't reflecting light, it was generating it. A soft, blue-white glow pulsed from the center of the lens array, rhythmic like a heartbeat, casting strange shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. And covering every surface of the room were journals, hundreds of them, stacked and scattered. Decades worth of entries from people who'd found this place. I picked up the nearest journal and read. It was dated 1934, written by someone named Francisco who'd been searching for the lighthouse just like me. His entries started normally. Descriptions of finding the structure, climbing the stairs, discovering the light. But they quickly became disturbing. He wrote about asking the light questions. Simple ones at first. What's the weather tomorrow? Where did I leave my keys? Will my son recover from his illness? And the light answered. It would pulse in specific patterns, and somehow Francisco understood the answers. The weather prediction was perfectly accurate. He found his keys exactly where the light indicated. His son recovered. But then Francisco started asking bigger questions. He wanted to know things no one should know. The exact date of his death, the names of people who would betray him, the ultimate fate of humanity. And the light answered all of it. His handwriting became increasingly frantic as he documented the answers, as he learned things that broke something fundamental in his understanding of reality. His final entry said, "I know too much now. The light shows the truth behind everything, and the truth is that we're not supposed to know. Ignorance isn't weakness, it's protection. I'm leaving this journal as a warning. Don't ask the light anything you're not prepared to have answered forever." I read journal after journal. Dozens of people had found this lighthouse over the decades. All of them had asked the light questions. All of them had received answers. And all of them had been destroyed by what they learned. Some killed themselves. Others went insane. A few simply disappeared, their journals ending mid-sentence like they'd been erased from existence. The light pulsed brighter, responding to my presence. I felt a pull toward it, a compulsion to speak, to ask, to learn. The journals had warned me, but standing in that room with the impossible light pulsing and calling, I understood why everyone had asked anyway. Humans aren't built to resist answers. We're programmed to seek knowledge, to question, to understand. That's what makes us human. And that's exactly what makes this lighthouse so dangerous. I asked a simple question just to test it. I said aloud, "What's my mother's middle name?" I knew the answer, Elizabeth. But I wanted to see how the light responded. It pulsed in a specific pattern, 3 long pulses and 2 short. Somehow, without understanding how, I knew that pattern meant Elizabeth. The light had answered correctly. Emboldened, I asked something I didn't know. How did Cody Morrison die? The light pulsed a longer sequence, and suddenly I understood. I could see it in my mind. Cody had drowned in 1898, not accidentally but deliberately, walking into the ocean at night after visiting this lighthouse and asking questions he couldn't live with knowing the answers to. The light was waiting, I could feel it wanting more questions, harder questions, questions that mattered. And I wanted to ask them. I wanted to know everything. When would I die? What happens after death? Is there meaning to existence? What is this lighthouse? What is the light? Why does it answer? I grabbed a pen from my bag and opened a blank journal I'd brought for documentation. I wrote, "To whoever finds this next, I'm about to ask the light questions that the others were too afraid to ask. Questions about what we are, why we're here, what happens at the end. I'm a historian. My job is to uncover truth. This is the ultimate truth, and I'm going to document it." I asked the light, "What are you?" It pulsed a pattern so complex it took several minutes. When it finished, I understood. The light wasn't a thing. It was a connection, a doorway to something vast and old that existed outside of normal reality. It had been here before humans, before the lighthouse, before the land itself. It had watched everything, recorded everything, understood everything. And it wanted to share. Not out of benevolence, but because knowledge wants to spread. Truth wants to be known, even when knowing it causes harm. I asked, "Why do people go insane after learning from you?" The answer came instantly. Because truth and human psychology are incompatible. Your minds evolved to create useful fictions, meaning purpose, love, justice. I show you that none of it exists in the way you think. The universe is not built for you. You are accidents asking questions in a place that has no answers, only facts. And facts without meaning are poison to minds that need meaning to survive. I should have stopped. Every journal had said to stop. But I kept asking. I asked about the future, about the past, about the fundamental nature of reality. I asked about consciousness, about free will, about whether anything I'd ever done mattered. And the light answered everything. It showed me patterns I'd never seen, connections I'd never imagined, truths that unmade everything I thought I understood. I asked the final question, the one I'd been building toward. Should I have come here? The light pulsed once. Short, simple, definitive. No. I'm writing this now as the last coherent thing I'll probably ever do. The light is still pulsing, still offering to answer anything I ask. And I can't stop asking. Even knowing what it's doing to me, even feeling my mind breaking under the weight of too much truth, I can't stop. The light has shown me that curiosity isn't a virtue. It's a flaw. Humans weren't meant to know everything. We were meant to live in partial darkness, to guess and hope and believe without proof. The light has taken that away from me. If you're watching this channel, if you're drawn to stories about the dark places and the things that wait in them, understand this. Some mysteries exist as warnings, not invitations. The Whitmore light is still out there in the Georgia marshes, still pulsing, still answering. And it's waiting for the next person who thinks they're brave enough, smart enough, or curious enough to ask it questions. Don't be that person. Some answers cost more than ignorance ever could. If you want to hear more disturbing true stories from places that shouldn't exist, subscribe to Verified Fears. Because sometimes the scariest thing isn't what's out there in the darkness, it's what happens when you finally turn on the light.